Hello everyone, I'm Xand and welcome to my kitchen. Today I'm going to be showing you how to make sourdough bread. Sourdough bread is by far the most rewarding thing I've ever made in this kitchen. And the feeling of taking that first loaf out of the oven is a feeling I'd never forget. So sourdough bread is bread leavened with a starter or mother dough instead of commercial yeast. In my opinion, that makes it taste better, it makes it have a better texture, and it's also easier for you to digest. The reason for that is the slow fermentation process that it undergoes. Fair warning, this is going to take about 24 hours, maybe a little bit more, but I promise you it's worth it. If you don't have a sourdough starter, you can click somewhere up here, I think, and watch my video about making a sourdough starter from scratch. Just like that one, the process I'm going to show you is based on Maurizio's over at theperfectloaf.com. I'm going to link to that down in the description. I definitely recommend you check it out. So let's talk about what you need, and let's start with equipment. You're going to need a glass jar, a digital scale, a jug, some proofing baskets, a bench knife, 2 plastic bags, clips, a tea strainer, a scoring blade, parchment paper, oven mitts, and the biggest mixing bowl you can find. Next, let's talk about ingredients. A mature sourdough starter, you need water, salt, white bread flour, whole wheat flour, rye flour, and rice flour for dusting. So, the first thing we need to do is build our levain. A levain or leaven is essentially what we're going to be using in place of a commercial yeast. It's an offshoot of our mother dough or starter, and it's made with some fresh flour and water, and we add that to the dough to leaven it. So let's get started. First thing we're going to do is just get a clean jar onto our digital scale and zero it out. Then we're going to add okay, 40 grams. Then we're going to add 80 grams of filtered tap water. And then we're going to add 40 grams each of white bread flour and whole wheat flour. Okay, now that we've got all of our levain ingredients into the jar, we're just going to stir it up and make sure all of that flour and water combines and completely hydrates. Okay, once we're at this point, we're just going to seal it with the lid. Actually, let's put a clean lid on rather. And a little tip is if you have a rubber band, just to put it around the jar at the line of the bottom of the levain. This helps you keep track of how much it's risen throughout the day. We're going to put this into the oven, obviously off with the light on, because that keeps a sort of ambient temperature of about 27 degrees Celsius, which is the optimal temperature for this to ferment and rise. We're going to look for it to get at least doubled in size. Anything over that is sort of a bonus. It can take between 4 and 6 hours. It really depends on the flour, it depends on the temperature, but that's essentially the time frame we're looking at. So I'm just going to put this in the oven and we'll see how it's doing in a few hours. So, the levain's been going for about 3.5 hours. It's got about an hour left. That means now is the perfect time to start our autolyse. The autolyse, very simply, is the process of mixing our flour and our water. The whole point of this is to give it an hour for the enzymatic activity to kickstart, some gluten to start developing. That gluten is super important for the extensibility of the dough, so when we're stretching and folding, it doesn't tear, and it obviously lets the dough fill with gas. So we're going to get our scale down. We're going to add our mixing bowl and zero it out. And then we're going to add 600 grams of white bread flour, 200 grams of whole wheat flour, and 50 grams of rye flour. We're then going to add 650 grams of water to that, but we're going to hold back 50 grams of that to help mix in the salt and the levain at a later stage. So let's get into it. Okay, now that we've got our flour and our water in there, it's time to do the messy business of mixing that all by hand. We want to make sure that we get all of this flour hydrated. We don't want any dry spots, so we just really got to mix it quite thoroughly. You could probably do this with a spatula or, I don't know, a spoon or something, but I like to do it with my hands. It's the most effective tool. Okay, that's what that looks like. Flour is completely hydrated. I'm just going to go clean my hands quick. Okay, now that that is mixed, I'm just going to cover it with a clean cloth, and I'm going to stick it in the oven alongside the leaven for the next 40 minutes to an hour. Okay, our ortolise has had about an hour, and our levain has had about 4.5 hours. They're both ready to go. Our ortolise has peaked more than doubled. If anything, it sank just slightly. That's not a huge deal. We may have let it go a little bit too long, but honestly it's not going to make the biggest difference. If we give it a sniff, it still smells quite neutral. It's got a little bit of sweetness, not a huge amount of sour coming off there, and that flavor is going to come through the bread. So what we're going to do now is we're going to add 18 grams of salt, and then we're going to add that reserved 50 grams of water just to help dissolve the salt and combine everything. And then we're going to have to get messy again. We're going to add all of our levain. I'm going to make sure we get as much of it out of this jar as possible. And then what we're going to do is we're just going to pinch it. Pinch the starter to combine it into everything. So we've pinched everything together, we've made sure it's nice and combined. That's what it looks like. And now we're going to start the process of bulk fermentation. Essentially what bulk fermentation is the first opportunity that all of the ingredients have had to sort of combine together and let the fermentation permeate everything. Over the next 4 hours, we're going to do stretch and folds, where we pull it up and fold it over each other every half hour. We're 30 minutes into our bulk fermentation. That means it's time for the first set of stretch and folds. What you want to do is wet your hand, get it under one side of the dough and stretch it up until you feel like it's going to break, and then fold it over itself. Turn and do it with the next side, turn, do it with the next side, turn, do it with the next side. Essentially what that is doing is the gluten inside there is being stretched and it's being put under stress, and that stress is what's going to actually strengthen that gluten. So we're just going to cover it up and do that again in another half an hour. Okay, it's been half an hour, so we're going to do our second set of stretch and folds. I can already see some air bubbles starting to form. You can see there. Okay, we're on our second to last stretch and fold. As we can see here, got a lot of air bubbles starting to form around the edge, and the dough is starting to feel a lot more aerated in general. See you in 30 minutes for the last stretch and fold. Okay, so we are at our last stretch and fold, thank goodness. You can see it's basically doubled in size, got lots of air bubbles around the edge. Let's get this over with. That's got another half an hour in the oven. And in the meantime, we're gonna get the proofing baskets ready. Okay, so here are our bannetons. Got some white rice flour, and this is what the tea strainer is for. But it just so happens that it makes the perfect tool for dusting bannetons with white rice flour. Gives it a nice even coating all the way around. So the reason we're using white rice flour is because it doesn't burn, number one, when you put it in the oven at very high temperatures, and number two, it won't be absorbed by the dough in the same way that wheat flour would. So now that we've got those dusted, we're going to set those aside, and we'll check back on the dough in about 25 minutes. Okay, we are finally finished with bulk fermentation. It's been about 4 hours, but we got there in the end. We can see that the dough has about doubled in size. It's nice and jiggly when you shake it. There's plenty of air in there. There's lots of bubbles that I can see just on the surface and around the edge. So what we're going to do next is we're going to get this out of this bowl onto the bench, and we're going to divide it and pre-shape it. Before we do that, I'm going to get some flour down. You don't want to be introducing too much flour into this, and for that reason, I've got a little bowl here of water that I'm going to be using on my hands and on my bench knife to just stop adding so much more flour into the mix here. So let's get this guy out of here. And I'm going to wet my bench knife, and I'm just going to cut this guy approximately in half because we want 2 loaves. If you want it to be super accurate, which you would in most instances, you could weigh each of these to make sure they're the same size. I'm just going to eyeball it. So next, I'm just going to wet this hand and the bench scraper, and we're just going to use these to pre-shape these. So even though we're not making round loaves of bread, we're going to be doing oval breads or batard. We do want to just shape them into rounds for now because we're going to rest them like that. We're just going to let these hang out for 25 minutes uncovered, and then we're going to do the next shape. Okay, those have been resting on the counter for 25 minutes. Now we're going to shape them and get them into their baskets. First thing we need to do is generously flour the tops of these. That's going to stop them from sticking to the counter while we're shaping them. And then just going to make sure my hands have some flour on them. And then let's get started. So I like to just get that flour underneath there to make sure it's not going to stick when you try to lift it. Try to move in swift motions like that. First thing we're going to do is we're going to take the bottom, or actually the first thing we're going to do is just loosen it up, make sure it's not stuck. It's quite happy on there. We're going to take the bottom, we're going to stretch it towards us. We're going to flip it up about 2/3 of the way up the dough onto itself. Just going to make sure we dust any excess flour off there. Then we're going to take each side, pull them out and fold in. Once again, making sure we get rid of any excess flour on the dough. Then we're just going to roll. We're going to try to keep it as tight as we can. And there we have it. We have our nice little bread cigar there. We're going to leave this to sit for just a few seconds now to sort of seal that bottom seam. So let's see how whether it's sticking or not. Okay, I'm going to take our bench scraper and go under, actually from this side so we don't break the seam. We're just going to plop it into its basket. And then we can see fits nice and snugly in there. Set that aside. bring the next basket over. This one we're going to add one extra step just to make it an even tighter sort of final dough shape. And then the extra step is we're going to roll it again from this direction. We're going to proof it overnight in the basket. And what's going to happen during that proofing process is that loaf is going to relax into the basket and it's going to fill that whole basket up pretty much. So let's get that into the basket. You just want to make sure that the bottom seam is nicely stuck. And there it is. We have our two doughs. We're going to put these into plastic bags overnight. And what that will do is it's going to stop moisture escaping from the breads. These are now going into the fridge for 14 hours. So I will see you and these breads tomorrow morning. Good morning everyone. It has been about 13 hours since we put the bread into the fridge to proof. So what we're going to do now is preheat the oven and the pot. Today I'm using just a cast iron Dutch oven. You can do this in a combo cooker if you want. You can do this in a round one. I've got this oval one, which is really nice because I'm making oval loaves. But yeah, we're going to get the oven going on bake at 250, and then we're going to get this in there to preheat with the oven. Okay, so oven's been preheating for an hour with the pot inside. This has been in the fridge for 14 hours. We're going to leave the other one in the fridge while we do the first one. I'm just going to get it out of the plastic bag and into the recycling. Now we need to get the loaf onto this piece of parchment. Easiest way to do this is with a pizza peel or a cutting board that's quite light. You can just flip it over, but you do risk degassing the loaf a little bit. Best thing to do is just to put the pizza peel on top and then flip it back over this way and then take the basket off. It's a good sign that that released nicely. We didn't overhydrate the loaf, didn't get stuck at all. Now what we're going to do is we're going to score the loaf with this. This is called a lamb, spelled L-A-M-E, and you can do like a fancy, interesting scoring job on these things. It's not really my style. I like to do just one sort of deep slash down the middle. Maybe one day we'll do some, I don't know, wheat motifs or something, but for today we're just going to go straight down the middle. You want to go in at a slight angle. You want to make sure that you get all the way through the dough. So what this does is it allows the bread to open up. If you don't do that, you'll start getting sort of weird cracks and tears in the surface, which is fine. But if you want a nice even open loaf, that's kind of what it does. So let's get this over to the oven. Okay, now we have some quite heavy duty oven mitts over here. That's important because you are dealing with an extremely hot pot in there. So we can get our pot out of there. Lid off. Just going to transfer the dough as swiftly and gently as we can. The last thing we're going to do before we seal this up is give it a spritz with some water. That steam is super important in helping the bread to rise, and sort of counterintuitively it helps give it a crackly crust with like nice blisters on it. So that's going in there for 20 minutes covered. After those 20 minutes are done, we're going to take the lid off and give it another 18 to 20 minutes to brown out the crust. Okay, so that loaf has been in there for 20 minutes. We are going to leave the lid in the oven because we want the, that's looking beautiful by the way, we want the lid to keep hot while we finish that loaf. Okay, so it's been 18 minutes. We're just going to take a quick peek and see if it's ready to pull. Yeah, that looks beautiful. we're just going to get this out of here. Keep the pot in the oven just to maintain its temperature for the next loaf. Okay, just going to get this onto a rack to cool. The best part is the smell. We want a nice hollow sound. That means there's plenty of air in there. The crumb is nice and open. You can see there's lots of nice blistering along the edges. That's from the steam that we introduced and the moisture inside the loaf itself. And you can see all that beautiful gluten. So this is the hardest part. You really shouldn't cut into this until it's fully cooled. That can take up to 2 hours. The reason for that is if you cut into it now when it's steaming hot, the moment you crack it open, all of the steam inside this loaf is just gonna rush out and you're gonna get a stale loaf in like a day. That said, the first loaf you do take out of the oven, I guarantee you will eat all of it on the first day. So you can disregard that last piece of advice, just cut that thing open and start munching on it. But yeah, it's time to repeat that whole process with the second loaf. Okay, that's the second one done. Again, lovely hollow sound. See, both of these loaves have beautiful ears on them. That's what this, the sort of edge of that crust is called. I'm pretty happy with the size there. I think this is the one that we sort of bound a little bit more tightly. You can see it's a little bit shorter and stubbier than the other, and I'm totally okay with that. This will make for good sandwich bread. Let's take a look inside this one because it's cooled to a point that I'm pretty confident it's not going to lose too much moisture if we cut it open. Let's get this thing open and see what it looks like. Moment of truth. I'm pretty happy with that. So, see, we got a couple big bubbles, but in general we got quite a nice, even, open crumb. Oof, that smell is too good. And you can see the nature of sourdough. You can crush it, springs right back, and you can hear, well, I hope you can hear, that really nice crackly crust. Now, if you don't mind, I'm going to cut myself a slice. Something that's important to me when I'm baking sourdough is that the sort of brown outer ring around the edge of the bread doesn't penetrate too deep. That to me is an over-baked loaf of bread. It does ultimately come down to preference, but it's kind of like cooking a steak. When you cut through a steak, you want it to be nice, even pink all the way through. You don't want a big grey ring around the edge of the meat. And to me, that's kind of similar here. You want a nice, crackly, hard crust, but you don't want it penetrating too far in. So, that is how you make sourdough bread. I know that was a really long process. If you're still watching, thank you very much for sticking with me. I hope you try it. If you do, let me know on Instagram. My DMs are always open and checked. And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.